people to join on the webinar. So for those of you who are in the room, we're not expecting a fire drill. So if the fire alarm does go off, we do actually need to leave the building. And if you do need toilets, they're just through the door there on your right. It's okay for you to go in and out. And if you need to leave early, that's also absolutely fine. There will be time for you to ask some questions at the end, but I'll ask Jarel some questions first to warm you up. Okay. So hello. It's a pleasure to welcome you both here on campus and those of you joining us online to this In Conversation event hosted by York St John University in celebration of LGBT History Month 2022. I'm Professor Esther McIntosh. I'm the Associate Head of the School of Humanities for Religion, Politics and International Relations, and I'm delighted to be in conversation tonight with the Reverend Jarel Brown. Jarel is a British-born Jamaican Londoner. He was raised with his elder sister by his grandmother. Originally a Methodist, Jarel began his preaching career in the Ealing Trinity Circuit in 2006, embarking on ordination training at Wesley House, Cambridge in 2010. He has served Methodist churches in South Wales and London, as well as serving on their Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee. In 2020, Jarel became an Anglican, and we'll talk more about that decision shortly. He is an associate chaplain at King's College London and currently serves as curate at St Boltoff's Aldgate Church in London, which is a member of the Inclusive Church Network. He is the vice chair of One Body, One Faith, an ecumenical grassroots charity empowering LGBT+ Christians and advocating for change. Jarel is passionate about justice, especially in relation to race and sexuality. His book, Black British Christian Queer, is described by Peter Tatchell as a liberation theology for the 21st century, that challenges the straight white church with a call to overturn its long history of racism and homophobia, and to embrace love, diversity, inclusion, and equality for all. There are a couple of copies of this book here tonight that Jarel has brought with him, if you don't have a copy and would like to buy one, and if you also have cash, which I know people generally don't carry anymore. If not, you can order it from all good bookshops, as you would expect. So, welcome, Jarel. When did you first decide to write this book?
Funny, I didn't decide really for quite a long time. So I had given a paper at a conference, a theology conference called the Society for the Study of Theology. And it was on race and queer black bodies. And after that, a commissioning editor from SCM Press, who the book was published with, came up to me and said, do you have a book on that? At any point, kind of in you to publish. And I was just not interested in that. So I was quite happy to give that paper, but that was me done with that topic. I said, I'd really love to publish something on church history, and David was not interested in that at all. So he wanted something a bit sexy. I'm not publishing this now. I have no interest in writing about it. And then I was sat at my desk one day, and suddenly the book just came together, and all the chapter headings just kind of fell into place. I thought, well, maybe I could do this, because the idea just became very clear. And I got back in touch with David. I said, well, I think I might have a book, expecting him not to be interested anymore, because I'd taken a year to basically get in touch. And then it kind of came about, and it changed because I signed the contract before COVID-19, before the pandemic. And it's not the book I thought I was going to write, because libraries were shut and I couldn't see friends and grab meals and go for coffees and talk things over in a normal way. But it did become this, and I think it's a very different book, but probably the book it needed to be in the end.
Okay, so can you tell us a bit more about the title? Black, Gay, British, Christian, Queer. Is this title you had in mind right from the start, or did that go through a few iterations? And the ordering of these adjectives, is that important to you?
The title was the hardest thing to pick, actually, and I messed with it constantly and kept changing it. And it was really weird because I couldn't start the writing until I had decided what the title was going to be. And I kept asking my friends, what do you think about this? And the things that I thought were incredible. They were like, no, you can't go with that, that's crap. And then in the end, I just gave in and thought, I'm going to go with this. And the reason why is because I think it spells out very clearly what the book is wrestling with, which is all of those adjectives, some of which sit quite comfortably, Christian, Black, some of which don't, British, for example, and queer, perhaps the ones that I might wrestle with more. And I think for me to put them all together was quite powerful, just to show people that for some of us, all of those things are part of who we are. And some of them you choose for yourself, and some of them are put upon you. But they're actually things that people think are naturally kind of contradictory. You know, that you can't be black and gay, or black and Christian, or Christian and queer, and all those things, black and British. I mean, all of that is contested. So for me, that was why it was quite important to have all of that there.
Fantastic. So in the book, Hannah Lightsey, who, you know, for people who don't know, she's the author of Our Lives Matter, A Woman's Queer Theology. And she speaks of the risk that you're taking as a black person critiquing racism and whiteness within the LGBTQ plus community. Were you worried about the reception your book would receive from within the LGBT plus community? And in your own words, do you feel safe enough?
I think for the first part of that, I would say that it's quite hard to name oppression and marginalization within a group that already sees itself as oppressed and marginalized. To kind of name for other LGBTQ plus people oppression that takes place within those spaces is quite hard. And one of the things I often say to people is that all of us, regardless of who we are, because of the way the world is now, has a knee on someone else's neck. And that's quite a hard thing to say to people who already see themselves as the marginalized. So you can be black and heterosexual and homophobic. You can be white and queer, but racist. You can be black, gay, and transphobic. So, you know, there's so many things that where oppression can come out of someone who's already oppressed and marginalized. So there was a risk in naming that for a community that sees itself as part of the oppressed. And every now and again, there is pushback from people who say, you know, we're surprised that you could kind of say these things or name that for us. And I think Famine of Grace is right in the sense that not only is that hard, but then again, to go to the safety net question, I'm not sure safety ever exists, really, in the way in which we imagine it. And I'm looking for safety in two ways. I'm looking for safety as someone who's black, but also safety for someone who's queer. And you very rarely find that kind of double sense of safety in any space, I think. And I'm still able to say that as someone who's got cis privilege in the world. But there's still that sense of, you know, vulnerability, regardless. And I have an extra level of safety, I think, as a Christian leader as well, to say those things from a kind of educated, theologically educated perspective, which other black people might not have. So
yeah, but safe space is something that Sharon and I have explored in relation to trans and non-binary students at university as well. So the subtitle to the book, or essence of the book, is the Famine of Grace. Grace is a very theological concept, and maybe not a term that we use very much outside theological circles. So could you define grace for us and tell us a bit more about why you choose the word famine as well? Sure.
I think grace, the easiest way for me to describe it is it's the love of God with flesh on. Peter Groves, I mentioned this in the book, he says that grace is the cruciform love of God, meaning grace in the shape of the cross. And I love that. But I think for me, I want to go even further and say that grace for me is about embodying love. It's about taking seriously the fact that love is a verb, and that we see that verb so fully in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. For me, that's what grace is. It's not a theory, it's not just a feeling. It's something, it's love that we can take seriously because we see the cost of it. We see it acted out. And then for me, I think the famine word was really crucial and really deliberate because famine has multiple causes. And actually famine, if there is a famine, it affects everybody. And the thing about the Famine of Grace to me is that I think those who are cisgender and heterosexual might think that they are not affected by the oppression that LGBT plus people face. But my point about choosing the word family is actually they are. You know, everyone is worse off in the church because of how LGBTQ plus people are treated. Even though we face the extreme brunt of that. And famine is also something that's caused, you know, by war, by political decisions, by the way in which we treat the environment. It's got so many different layers. And it also causes death quite slowly. And it's not always immediately apparent. That's the other thing I think. So famine is a very difficult word. And I'm not sure the church has realized the extent of the damage that it's doing to itself by the way it treats LGBTQ plus people. So it was a really deliberate word. And that could have almost been the title.
Sure. Yeah, definitely runs right through the book. Yeah. So Christianity is often portrayed as having love as its kind of central motive, but the fact of racism and homophobia is clearly undeniable. But at what point did you start to become aware of that discrimination? So looking back at your childhood, what was Sundays like? What was church like for you as a child?
Sunday was amazing. It was a lovely day. It was kind of one day when we all, as a family, got together. And growing up in a Jamaican family, Sunday meant that you went to church and then you had a massive family meal afterwards. And everyone got around the table and the house was full and packed. So Sundays was lovely. And it always felt like a very good family time where actually people on the whole didn't argue on a Sunday. We did, but not on a Sunday. Sunday just had a very warm, welcoming, inclusive feeling. And actually lots of people would pop in on a Sunday and just suddenly sit around the table. We weren't expecting, but there was a sense of open door policy in the family that I grew up in. And church was good on the whole, you know. For all the things I say about it, one thing I will say about my home church that I grew up in West London, was that it did show me the love of God. It did show me what grace was like. It wasn't until I grew up out of that local context that I began to see something very different. And that's where I think, you know, my critique of it would be that I don't think I could have been my adult self in that particular church. It was safe and okay because I was young and in people's minds probably straight, you know. I hadn't got to that point of being myself completely. I often joke and say to people, I didn't realize that I was black until I went to Cambridge. And people think that I'm completely, but it's true. I grew up in West London, surrounded by people from all around the world. Went to a school really close to Heathrow Airport. Actually, the black kids were the majority in the school. Didn't know really what racism was. I heard about it from my parents, and my mum would keep telling me about, you know, how important it was to be conscious as a black kid. And I used to think, this is your problem. You know, that's done now. Don't know what you're on about. The world is my oyster, like all of that. Suddenly go to Cambridge and then have people constantly say, you know, where did you learn to speak English so well? Where are you training for ordination to go back to? What part of the world are you from? And I would say, Ealing, London. No, where do you really come from? West London. And that wasn't enough, but they would ask, you know, which part of Africa? And so, well, you tell me because I don't know. You know, you would just, but that sense of othering constantly. And also had a bottle of urine thrown at me by the EDL in Cambridge, and that was as harsh by skinheads, you know, white man, completely opened up my eyes to a different world. And it was then that I began to realize that the church wasn't what I thought it was. You know, I had to really wrestle with who I was as someone who was gay and wanted to be openly gay, and someone who was black and who was Christian, and I really believed in it, but knew that that wouldn't all fit together easily.
Okay, so church was a big place for you as a child.
In the beginning, yeah,
you felt loved. Sundays were a great time, but then you studied at Cambridge. You suddenly realised that you'd grown up in white Christianity, and obviously wrestling then with sexuality as well, with heteronormative American culture you've grown up with. So, what was your survival?
I don't know if I really had one. I think part of the survival strategy was kind of not coming out fully until I was already out of the house. So, you know, I chose to come out in my first year of seminary, theology college, which was crazy, and I did it over Facebook via Facebook posts, which I don't recommend, but it was the only way I could find. And I just did it, and I was like, this is who I am. If you don't like it, it's tough. And I did it because I'm out of the house. You know, if I get kicked out, it's okay because I didn't need to go back home and I have another option. I had already been selected for ministry ordination, so I was like, this is okay. I never have to go back home again. I didn't spend the first Christmas after coming out at home. I spent it with my best friend's family because it was just a nightmare. I think my survival strategy was that. I waited to come out until it was safe enough for me. Still not completely easy. Very public, I think, because I chose to do it that way. But it also meant I didn't then have to go around to everyone and say, this is who I am. I could just get it done. I think my family did not appreciate the fact that I didn't tell them first. But that would not have worked either. And that was very clear from the action. But I think my survival strategy was probably in kind of really taking refuge in close friends. And taking refuge in the sense that I knew that I had to do that to survive. And then really trusting that it was kind of come out or die. because I knew that the options were not that many. And I had to do it then. And the other thing, I trained and was taught by lots of gay clergy. We kind of knew we're gay, but it was never spoken as out. The whole atmosphere, I think, of the church has changed, particularly in theological colleges since my time. They were not, I trained in 2010, there were no rainbow flags flying. People did not talk about sexuality that openly at all. And there was a kind of hiddenness to people's sexuality, and I knew I didn't want to be like that. So I made the decision that if I was going to go into priesthood, it meant I had to be open about this, to have some integrity. And that was part of my survival strategy, really. Almost to make myself more vulnerable.
So that you could be yourself as part of your identity. I know that gay Christians are often asked, well, why don't you just leave the church? So if you just leave when it's part of your identity, then that's not an option for you. And you knew from quite a young age you wanted to be a priest. So why go from Methodism to Anglicanism?
How long do you have? Oh dear, I think, so I'm always very clear about this, and I've tried to be as honest as I can, and that is to say that I think whenever, we've had a lot of people leave the Church of England recently to become local Catholic, and a lot of people online say, I wish they would kind of make a statement as to why they've left. And of course, there'll be lots of reasons for why people have done that. But in my own situation, I think what is true is my own kind of pushback against giving a very clear narrative, because there's a bit of me that, if I'm being honest, says, this is where I am now, and I can tell you how A led to B and B led to C, and how that makes sense for me. But because I take God seriously, I'm aware that there's this massive grey area that I really don't know about. That actually, part of that journey, I don't really know what was going on, or why I'm where I am. But then the facts for it, for me at the moment, are that in many ways Methodism left me. I didn't leave it. So I went into Methodism. It was a church I was growing up in. I always knew it as a church in which it was okay to be openly gay, because it decided in 1993 that, gay clergy were okay. I had a good 6 years in Methodist ministry, and I served for 5 years in Cardiff and then for a year in Southeast London. And I was open about who I was through the whole process. Cardiff was fine, had lots of issues in terms of racism, but not sexuality. I moved from Cardiff to Southeast London, because in Methodist ministry you move and you don't have much say in where you go. And the churches I had in Southeast London, unlike the ones in Wales, were black majority. So I knew it was going to be difficult, but I didn't know it was going to be so difficult. And I thought, if it is hard, at least I'm in a denomination that says I'm okay. So surely if, stuff goes wrong here, the church will step in and say, well, this is your ministry, you kind of have to get on with it. Long story cut short, the people there were not happy to have someone who was openly gay and black. And the church just didn't intervene in the way it should have done. And it kept wanting to have, conversations around reconciliation, trying to make the peace here. I was saying, well, actually, I've done nothing wrong except come here with me and be me. And you decided in 1993, when I was 2 years old, that this was okay. So why are we having conversations about reconciliation? And it just got worse and worse. So 6 months in, I left that post and decided whether I really could stay in that post. And lots of people say the Church of England is a much worse place in terms of sexuality. And in some ways they're right. But I think the thing about the Church of England is it does at least talk about how crap it is. In terms of the realities of LGBT plus people. And I think a lot of people now, particularly because Methodism has decided to do same-sex marriages, think that actually that means that the whole of Methodist Church is an inclusive space. No, it's not. And what makes it dangerous is, I think, itinerancy. Is if people are constantly moving around, and actually people don't have that much say in where they go, and if congregations are not honest about where their red lines are, you can end up as someone who's a woman or disabled or black or queer in a space that actually is very hostile to you. And if the church doesn't intervene, that's it. And in the Church of England, for all of our messes, we do have churches that say, this is who we can't accept. And I think actually it almost makes it safer for some people, because it means you won't end up there and be abused. And actually Methodism hasn't got the honesty yet to say we're not a church in which everyone can go in. So that was part of it, and also a vocational thing of just feeling that I needed to be in a different church, in a different space. But I probably won't ever know why that move happened. It's a long, messy answer, but it's the honest one.
Sure. So it's, an inclusive policy to do, the NIA that then prevents those discussions that need to be had. How do your family feel about you being Anglican rather than Methodist?
Luckily, I mean, they're strongly Methodist. They were Methodist in Jamaica, so that was a kind of very much the family religion. But they're just happy that I'm still serving God. And for them, that was the fundamental thing. And I think the thing that has been most important is them knowing I'm in a place where I can be me. And I think that was the major thing, that I haven't walked away from my vocation completely. And that was what was at the heart of it for me. I knew there was something true about my call. And despite the reaction I got from very homophobic people, I wasn't willing to give up my vocation just because some people were so hateful. So it was about salvaging that sense of call in whichever environment I could do that in. So they've been okay, luckily.
You recall a very moving story in the book about the symbolism of the dog collar at a pride event, and a mixed-race woman coming off to speak to you specifically because of the dog collar. Tell us a bit more about what happened and what it meant to you.
It was an amazing moment. So I was meant to be going to a mass at Pride. They always have a Eucharist at Pride. I think it happens in St. Giles in the Fields, which is an inclusive church just near Tottenham Road. And I was meant to be participating in that. So I went to Pride, I think I was in my cassock actually, to go to that afterwards. And I was there with the straight friend, who's a great ally, a wonderful guy. And then we were just walking, and I heard this girl just scream, "A priest!" And she ran like through these crowds. And I thought, here we go, what's going to happen? I thought I was going to get, dressing down about how awful it is and how they be here and all that stuff. But she was just blown away. And she was like, I've never seen someone like you at this. Are you real? Are you really? And I get that all the time. Is it fancy dress? You're too young to be a priest. All of that stuff. I'm used to it now. And I was like, yeah, this is me. I'm a priest. And she said, wow. She was like, I go to church a lot. I used to go more frequently, but since our priest found out that me and my partner are gay, we don't go anymore. And she thought, oh, this is my partner. And she put out this lady and showed me her and said, I really love her, we love each other, but we haven't got a church to go to. And at the end of pouring out her heart to me, she said, would you give us a blessing? And there and then I just blessed both of them, prayed with them. And she was just hugging me, and so was her girlfriend. It was just lovely. I don't know her name, never kept in contact, no idea who she is, that was it. But it was one of the most profound encounters for me. And I think that happened particularly because she saw someone who was a church leader and who was a person of colour. And I think all of her assumptions about the church and the queer community just suddenly, were challenged by me being there. And at that time, I didn't have a church, so I couldn't invite her anywhere because it was in between me becoming an Anglican and leaving Methodism. So I had nowhere to say, come to church to, but it was a really beautiful moment. And for me, it just kind of showed me the importance of showing up and actually wearing this stuff. And actually getting into conversations with people and challenging their ideas about who you are. Because people assume all kinds of things. Singleness, celibacy, heterosexuality, all of it by this. So to break that.
And particularly for LGBT+ people, they generally thinking the church says homosexuality is a sin, so that's why you're not sure about the reaction you're going to get when someone comes running up to you as a priest at Pride. But again, sin is a very Christian word or theological word. You also don't think of sexuality as a sin in the way that that's usually understood. So how do you define sin?
It's a really hard one. In the book, I purposely avoid it, and all my friends who are theologians in the academy in a more kind of professional way critique me a lot. They're like, oh, you really don't understand grace because you don't talk about sin in the book. I thought, I don't want to. Because I think the one thing we're used to hearing as LGBT+ people is about the sinfulness of life and the sinfulness of who we are, sinfulness of sex and desire and all of that. That's why we know, we've heard that before, it's old. So is there a way of talking about grace without referring to sin, which is a challenge? And I think friends of mine who drag me for it make a point, but equally, I didn't want to do that. And I think for me, sin, this is where I kind of lean slightly towards the kind of Roman Catholic thing. And I think that's where the Roman Catholic Church got completely wrong. I don't agree with hardly anything they say, but that, in making a differentiation between sin. So, mortal sins being the kind of really big things, and the venial sins being the kind of less serious things, but equally things that we should look at and examine. And I don't think that all sin is the same. But I would say that sin is anything that makes us less loving. Sin is a thing that makes us less charitable. And not just towards other people, but towards ourselves. So I say it's the opposite of grace in the sense that for me, grace is the thing that enables us to see ourselves as God sees us. And I would say that sin is the thing that stops us from seeing ourselves as God sees us. And that stops us from seeing other people as God sees them. So sin is the thing that makes me treat people as objects of other people. It's the thing that makes me feel as though I am worthless, not loved. Sin is that thing that decreases my ability to love. I think we all kind of know. We don't really have to have it defined. We know what sin is. It's the thing that really does keep us up at night. And the things that are not that serious probably don't keep us up at night, and therefore not perhaps that serious. But I think sometimes the church forgets that people often do know what sin feels like. And people are much more aware of that because it eats us up and it feels uncomfortable. We don't always need it defined. So I didn't want to
focusing upon individual actions rather than relationships. And
I think institutional sin and systemic sin is really important for me. What does corporate sin look like? And I think often we don't have enough of an understanding of that. We go to the individual all the time.
Okay, so drawing on the work of womanist scholars, you refer to Christianity as body-phobic.
Yes.
So what does freedom look like for Black Christian queer bodies?
I think it has to be fundamentally the ability to love who you want to love. And for that love to be able to be expressed in the fullness of what love looks like. So that means sexual love, that means intimacy, that means all of that. And I think to be able to do that safely is also what freedom looks like. And I think people almost have to define it for themselves, because I think the moment your freedom is defined for you, that's not really freedom. It obviously has to have limits, because we all have to live alongside each other somehow. But I think freedom for different people means different things. I often think about what Jesus says about, I've come to bring life and life in all its fullness. That's freedom to me. But actually, life in all its fullness looks like different things for different people sometimes. But that freedom to love has got to be the fundamental thing. Because if you're not free to love, almost any other freedom doesn't matter. I think that's the biggest thing. And it feels like the greatest captivity, I think, if you're not able to love freely. When you read things like slave narratives, one of the big things that people talk about is that sense of not being able to have freedom to love, and that sense of following love and where love takes you. It's huge.
So you say in the book that the church's silence or ambiguity around LGBT lives sends the message that God's mind is not made up. And then drawing on Angela Davis, you say the church needs to become queer.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
I think I see a courage in the queer community that I find deeply moving and deeply challenging, I think. And I can remember the first time I encountered other Black queer people, and I was like, wow, it was almost overwhelming for me. And it's really interesting because I trained with the only other Black gay priest, openly Black gay priest that I know in the UK, Jide Macaulay, someone you might know of. And we trained together in Cambridge, and I can remember the first time I met Jide, and I really disliked him. And it was because he was so open and free about who he was. I just couldn't handle it. And I was like, wait, I actually can't communicate with you because this is too much. Yeah. And I had come up by that point, but I still wasn't able to be as free as him. And I think there's something about the courage that we have to embody as queer people, particularly queer people of colour, that is a model for the church of the kind of courage it needs to step out in the face of injustice and oppression and say, actually, these are the people that God loves. And of course, that will cost the church hugely, which is why it doesn't say it. But that is a courage that you see all the time. And I see it so much now in the trans community. Actually, the courage to be yourself in a world and a culture and a family, perhaps, that doesn't actually want you to be yourself is huge. And I look at trans friends, I just think, you're so brave. And it's not a bravery that I have. I feel brave as someone who's openly gay in the church, but when I look at trans friends, that's a different kind of bravery for me. And it's a bravery on so many different levels. And so when I talk about the church becoming queer, I really mean it. It should look at the queer community and try to model some of the virtues that are there, because actually there's so much. And the love and inclusion that you see in queer communities. You know, one of the things we often talk about is chosen family and the ways in which we often, you know, take each other under each other's wings, because often family and close friends from before we were open about who we are lost. And we create our own safe spaces, our own family. And when I look at how porous our communities are and how many people can come into that space, I often think about how amazing it would be if the church could model itself on that kind of openness, you know, the way in which we love and forgive and find ways of being. That's what I think it means for the church to become queer, to become more vulnerable and to become more courageous.
Okay, so I'll ask you now a bit more about institutional racism in the church. So you mentioned that obviously while you're writing the book, COVID happened, but also the death of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests. And you call out the hypocrisy of churches saying Black Lives Matter, whilst not acknowledging white supremacy and its intertwining with Christianity in their churches. And then last year, in response to the anti-racism task force, the archbishops announced a racial justice commission. Is this just another means of maintaining power, delaying change, and actually not undoing institutional racism?
I think so. You know, one of the people I loved from the past was Tony Benn, for all his flaws, but he was a great inspiration to me, not just because of his pipe smoking, but because of who he was. And one of the things I always remember him saying is, you know, people have power, you need to ask them a few questions. One of them is, how do they get it? What are they going to do with their power? Who elected them? And how do we take their power away? And I think we need to ask the same things about the church, and particularly about our bishops often. Because it is quite a closed off secret process in many ways. And I think, you know, what does it take to make the church anti-racist, or for the church to become more diverse and inclusive? You don't need an anti-racism task force. People have power and privilege and need to be asked why they won't let that go. It's not complicated, you know. We have vacancies and we fill them with a certain kind of person. It's not complicated, and that's a choice, you know. And I think it's just a complete delusion and a waste of people's time to pretend as though we need more committees and more processes to try and find out what the problem is. We know what the problem is. Some people have power and privilege and won't give it up. You know, it's not as though there are no black clergy, no black people to fill, or queer people, whoever it might be, to fill posts and to make the church more diverse and inclusive. People don't want it. And why don't they want it? And that's the question I would want to ask. And I could never be part of a task force or anything like that, because you just couldn't waste my time getting me to sit around the table trying to work out what the problem is when we know. And it's a kind of ongoing thing. And I think the people, and some of them are friends of mine, the people who participate in these processes are almost as guilty as the people who hold the power and privilege, because we know that the process is not going to take us to where we need to be. So why do we do it? And that is why I talk about, and I know people think it's very extreme, but to talk about language of abolition, because I don't think you can reform an institution that is designed to hold power and privilege in a certain way. You know, you're not going to change the church to become what it ought to be without a massive destruction of what upholds it. And that means we all lose out, even those of us who are already oppressed and marginalized within it. I have to also be willing to lose out for the church to become what it needs to be. And even gay clergy or color can be complicit in oppression because we are part of an institution that hates us. And that's a really hard thing to say. And not many people would agree with me, but it's something I think is true for me. I'm often questioning, you know, why am I part of this institution that I know at its heart is kind of designed to not help people like me thrive. I don't know the answer to that, but being honest is something I wrestle with all the time.
Sure, and you're pushing back.
Yeah, trying to.
Do you also reflect on the death of Justin Fashionet? And at the time that he took his life in 1988, there was a lot of talk about this being to do with evangelical Christianity. And you refute that to some extent and say that the church was not a burden to him. Do you want to explain a bit more?
Sure. I think the honest truth is none of us know. And I remember when I was writing that that part of, I always had known about Dustin Pashley, but I never watched kind of everything about him. As part of the research, I kind of had to read everything and watch a lot of things. And I had to stop the writing process because it was so traumatic. I remember just watching videos of him talking about his faith, and I never heard that. I just had to stop because I was like, gosh, why are people so quick to deny the truth of his belief in Christ just because he was black and gay? So it's almost as bad as the people who say you can't be black and gay. It's like, we don't know. And he actually did, he refused to play on Sundays because he wanted to do things like be in church and speak to young children in Sunday schools. And I just wasn't prepared to take that from him without more evidence. And people do it to people like James Baldwin, for example. People call, the Humanist Association claim James Baldwin for themselves. And he's often referred to as an atheist. I've read everything that James Baldwin's written, and he never calls himself an atheist. Critiques the church no end, like I do. And was a preacher and then left the church, but never says he doesn't believe in God. I mean, what is it about black people who situate themselves outside of the church? That means people want to immediately claim them as atheists, or say that means they've given up on their faith. But I think it's a completely sensible thing to be black and not part of the church. It completely makes sense to me. And with Dustin, I just had a feeling that I believed what he was saying when he spoke about what his faith meant to him. And I wasn't prepared to take that away. And I didn't like the fact that some people had done with such kind of clarity. No doubt his faith probably made him feel very conflicted, but it also might have been the one thing that made him know that he was loved. Maybe he did really believe in God. And maybe that gave him some small comfort in life. Not enough, perhaps, but something.
Especially in racism in football as well.
Yeah.
It's not all things from the church. So in the final chapter of the book, the final chapter is entitled "I'm Tired of This Church." And you explain these words from a small boy, but that you and many black people and many people in the LGBT community will feel those words quite deeply. But you remain hopeful that the church can change. And I read the last chapter as a call for action, and as you mentioned, you talk about abolition, destabilization, deconstruction. Are you calling for the church of England to be disestablished?
Yes. I really don't think it can take any of what it says seriously about gender or race or sexuality seriously without that. Because there's just too much safety and too much looking over its own shoulder about what other people think about it, and too much of an ego that actually it's the state church, and okay, that's lovely. But what are you doing as the state church, really? And every now and again, I'm conflicted because I see, a bishop say a really amazing thing in the House of Lords. And they did do a really good job recently on the Nationality Importance Bill. And every now and again on maybe domestic violence or cladding, they really do challenge the House of Lords. But I just find it odd that we're okay with having such a privileged voice in such a multicultural society. That one particular Christian denomination gets to have such a seat in a house of power, and that's one particular denomination of one particular religion, and other religions don't get a look in. I think it would completely make sense for me for the chief rabbi to be in the House of Lords, and the imam to be in the House of Lords, and for the head of the Sikhs to be just. I don't get why only we get a say there, despite the history of the country. And I think the church is just too worried about what other people think about it to be a prophetic voice. And until you can do that freely, to be so tied to empire means you can't really be free. And it's a really unhealthy thing, I think. And I wonder often what we're scared of by letting go of that. What is it that we think we will lose completely? And if that counts more than being the church that Jesus had in his mind, then should we be doing what we're doing at all? Actually, probably not.
Okay, so one final question for me related to law and the church. The conversion therapy ban that the government has been promising for since 2018, I think, and it's now delayed again. Do you think they are going to pass legislation to ban conversion therapy? And then, in terms of the church, is same-sex marriage going to be accepted by the Church of England?
You said something about me earlier, which is probably not true, which is that I'm hopeful. I don't think I am. Someone recently on a panel, a Black political theorist and sociologist, was saying that to be Black and hopeful is to be a liar. And I really wrestled with what she said, but I thought actually she's right. And that was Dr. Zoe Samudzi. And he said that, to be Black and hopeful is to be amnesiac, ahistorical, to just be completely false about where we are at in the life of the world. And I agree with her. And yet, as a Christian, it's really hard to wrestle with that sense of not being someone who's hopeful in the normal sense of people's understanding of that. I kind of walk a tightrope between nihilism, Afro-pessimism, all kinds of things, to be honest. But the conversion therapy thing, I don't think it will be banned. And I think what worries me about that, and I've become more convinced of that recently, is that there are so many Christians who are adamant that they will lose something if this ban was to go ahead. And there is so much I could say about that, which would be deeply uncharitable, because I don't have charity at the moment to speak kindly about those people. But there was a big list of signatories, you might have known recently, of a letter that went to number 10 into this trust about this, to try and make sure that their rights are protected, because they want to be able to offer, prayers for people who might be wrestling with this stuff.
Yeah,
and I think
it was something like 2,500 signatures, and about 750 of them were Church of England priests, bishops.
Names of people I know well who were very nice to me, and and I just think, what's going on? Number one is that's just not how prayer works. And number two, how can you do that as a Christian? So I'm hesitant, because I just think actually if you have that amount of challenge with the present government that we have, let's be honest, I don't think that will happen, because they're going to take seriously their concerns. So it's on those of us who are pro the ban to really fight this. And if it's not through this government, then we have to keep going, because it has to stop somehow, and we have to make sure that it is made legal. It will obviously still happen in some context, but we need to do all we can to make that as risky as possible for those who want to carry it out. On the same-sex marriage thing, and I would say for me, the ban of conversion therapy is a much more pressing issue for me personally than the equal marriage stuff. I'm passionate about it, but where I'm situated within the LGBT community, the conversion therapy stuff is so much more pressing, because I know so many people of color who have experienced that, and who have gone through that within their own families, within so many different cultures, wherein this is practiced as a kind of normal thing. And I think for me, the equal marriage thing, as much as it's important, I'm not sure it's the priority, particularly in the church, for many people to suddenly get married in the church, because people are so hurt by it already. Am I hopeful? Not on that either. And I think it's because of the church's process. We have this thing at the moment in the Church of England called Living in Love and Faith, which it could be called many things, but that's what it's called. I personally don't really want to partake in it, because again, it goes back to that whole thing about, is it a process that will get us to where we need to be? My big issue with it is it's a discussion document, really. It has no proposals in it about where it might actually take us as firm proposals. And those who don't want to engage with it simply won't. And we're already pretending to be one church, but actually we're not one church. And I think we need the honesty about that. And the idea that I can go through this process where we look at slides of different kinds of people, and we watch videos of trans couples and interracial couples who are different backgrounds and all of that stuff, and we listen to these people's stories, and we hear from young widowers and older widows and all this kind of stuff, and see the breadth of those people. And apparently at the end of watching these videos and slideshows in rooms of people who vehemently disagree with me, I'm going to walk out of that process, and suddenly someone who's always thought that I'm going to hell is going to think I'm not. And there's a deep dishonesty about the fact that what we're asking for is for people's hearts to change. And you cannot force someone to love you who is convinced that all your worth is their hatred. And the idea that this process is going to make people's hearts change is just deeply dishonest, I think. I think what people need to be challenged by is, what is it about the other person that you find so unlovely? And if God can love them, why can't you? And that's the question, I think. why do you feel what you feel? And we're not asking that as part of anything.
Yeah. Well, so we do want to open up to questions from the audience. Just while you gather your thoughts for a minute, Jarel's going to read something for us. There is poetry and liturgy in this book, as well as prose. So, Jarel.
My best friend had a saying, and she always says it whenever life is going bad for her, basically. And she says, one day it will all make sense. And that's her kind of mantra. One day it will all make sense. And I wrote this poem on the basis of what my friend Nell often says. One day it will all make sense. And the myriad of moods we say good morning to will be one. One day the sun will shine and curtains blow with the pure winds of freedom that we are yet to know. They will come, rushing in like the tears and the sorrow and the hues we know so well, but cannot name. One day we will write in the past tense about the present as we dwell in the future. One day we will laugh till we cry, miss the last train together. One day we will be old and black and gay. One day we will have made it, and it will all make sense.
Thank you, Jarel. So, do we have questions from the audience?
I'm one of those Methodists that deeply mourns the loss of Jarel to our church. But it's delighted at the part that taken. Talk about grace as something you are entitled to demand, but it's also something that you ordained as a human being to give. And I just test with you the idea that that's to what extent the real bigotry is grace, and the real pain, the real violence in words and action. How much of that might be fear and not bigotry, not hatred, but fear. And that our church structures are so good at veneering politeness across so much of even the way we talk about things, because we're afraid of the real conversations that we need to have and what they might feel like, never mind what they might ask of us. And I test that as a 51-year-old white man who hasn't experienced what you had. As a white South African, who grew up in that structure as well. But as I get older and hopefully a bit wiser, and I see more in the congregation classroom, I see that the people who are the most obnoxious are often the most vulnerable and most afraid. And I wonder whether that resonates and what that does to your sense of the right to be outraged and how you manage your own compassion in being gracious.
No, thank you for that. That's a great
Just
question.
to paraphrase for the people online
Yes.
who can't hear the audience.
Okay.
So, is bigotry about fear?
It's interesting. I think one of the things I experienced when I was trying to serve two churches in South East London was, a real amount of kind of violent homophobia. One of the things I was shocked by was that sense of genuine fear. And I remember one meeting we had where we were trying to kind of get to the heart of what was going on for these people in this particular church. And there was a woman in the corner who had her Bible open and she was rocking and literally looked like she was going to be sick. She could not deal with the fact that we were genuinely speaking about someone who was openly gay and ordained. For her, it was just too much. And she physically, you could see the discomfort in her. And when people express how they felt, often one of the things they were really fearful of was losing their salvation. Should they receive communion from me, or should I baptize their children, or they come in here to preach? And it wasn't just a kind of theoretical thing. It was a genuine thing of, if we allow ourselves to be ministered to by you, are we going to hell too? And that was a genuine fear for me. And that was quite hard pastorally to kind of be like, well, this is clearly a genuine thing that they're struggling with. Although I have no time for it, it's an actual fear for them. And I think for other people, sometimes there is that to a much lesser degree. And I think, is it in 1 John that the words perfect love cast out all fear? I said, or maybe it's John or something. I'm not a biblical scholar, I should know. I think it's 1 John. And I think the opposite is true. That actually perfect fear casts out all love too. And in the church, that's it, and it's true in people, that fear, a bit like sin, decreases your ability to love. And I think that capacity for grace in themselves is decreased by what fear does. Because fear actually occupies a lot of space in us if we let it, you know. I'm not talking about the kind of normal anxiety that we all have living in this world of pandemic and potential wars and all that stuff, but a different kind of fear that says, you know, everything about who I am is potentially at risk, which is what I think some of the people in those congregations felt, that their whole identity, their whole world, their whole structure of meaning was at risk by my presence, you know, which is huge. And I can't really put myself into that place, but that is where they're coming from. So there's definitely something in that. And compassion, I think, is always something I struggle with, particularly when you have a pastoral responsibility for people who fundamentally don't want your pastoral care. You know, managing that and knowing that even in that situation where people are homophobic towards you, actually they die, you know, you're the one who's responsible for their funeral, and you know it's still going to happen under your watch, even if you're not the person taking it. They're really double-edged sword.
Yeah, another question.
That was a good lecture, and how long did it take you to write this part?
Longer than I thought it would take me. And part of that was writing it in the midst of a world that felt like it was falling apart. This is what took me long. I think I thought I knew how long it would take. And also I think people can't quite estimate or get a handle on how much the world and the church changed between when I signed the contract and when I started writing. Because, you know, when I signed the contract, the church was not talking about race at all. Not in this country, and not seriously. I still don't think it's talking about it seriously, but it wasn't as general a conversation as it is now. And the conversation around, you know, even some, you know, word like intersectionality, people did not know before. And suddenly people knew that word and were talking about it. So all the kind of explaining I thought I had to do just to start writing was suddenly taken away, because actually suddenly people did know the word. And they had read, you know, Renier de Lodge, and they had looked at other people when they weren't doing that before. It took me about a year fully to really write it. And I think it really did become a very different book because of that. And some of the things I was going to say to the church were not true anymore. You know, like the fact that it wasn't talking about race, or something it was. And I had never really looked at the reparations question, but suddenly it was looking at that, and, you know, all these kind of things. So there was a massive shift for me. The whole country was in a very different place by the time I started writing it.
Yeah.
What do you think of the two integrities? Does it touch what you've been talking about, or is it absolutely only to do with keeping women away from certain parishes? Or do you see it as a manifestation of something that's much more fundamentally wrong in the church?
It's a question about integrity.
I really struggle with it. Really struggle with it. For two reasons. I think because I started off in a church where that just wasn't a conversation, in the sense of, you know, it's not the same as saying all women have an easy time, because I know this didn't, like, you know, from personal conversation that lots of women clergy and Methodists had a hard time and still have a hard time. But there was no serious kind of conversation in the institution about having two kinds of understandings of ministry. That just wasn't a thing. So to be in a church now where it's a serious conversation, you have to, everyone who's ordained in the church has to accept these two integrities. For me, that was a big challenge. It was almost harder for me to do that than it was to sign up to issues in homosexuality about, you know, LGBT life, because I really wrestled with that, you know. And actually, the ministry of women for me is such an important part of who I am. My vocation came through the ministry of women, so I struggle with that. And equally, I wonder if it's the only way for us to get to a place where, as a church, we have more integrity. But I can't see the two integrities thing as anything other than misogyny for me. And I say that as someone who I think has done the theological work and is rooted in church history and knows about the reality of the history of the church. But I have to kind of call it for what it is. At the same time as loving colleagues with whom I deeply disagree, you know, and trying to respect what they call their integrity and their honesty about it. It's really hard for me. Yeah. it's difficult.
Yeah, so is there any advice you can give for Christians to destigmatize faith amongst other queers?
To destigmatize it?
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. I think it's really difficult. I think we have to not, one of the things I try never to do is to defend the church, to defend Christianity, because it has so many flaws and the church has done so much that is wrong. And I think we have to kind of name that. And that is quite difficult. I think journeying with people as they are is really important. And trying to hold our faith in a way. So I often say that I'm a convinced but humble Christian. And I'm very deeply convinced about my faith, but I'm a humble Christian, which means I don't want to batter other people with my faith. I think somehow you help destigmatize kind of Christianity by being a healthy Christian yourself. I think that's important as much as possible. I don't have an easy answer to that. Thank you.
Yeah, Jamie.
Thank you very much. I was deeply moved by your discussion of hope, and I'm someone who shares your lack of hope for the Church of England, from within the Church of England, that the deconstruction necessary will happen. But at the same time, the poem you read spoke very movingly about hope. It seemed like a deeply hopeful poem. And it made me wonder whether that kind of hope, abstract, very abstract, is the kind of hope that we need to motivate the deconstruction of the church's power structure that is necessary. And if that's the role of hope that you see, if there is a place for hope at all right now.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a question about the role of hope.
It's something I'm thinking a lot about at the moment because SST is coming up with the Society for the Study of Theology, and the topic for this year's conference is the end of the world. And so I'm giving a paper on the fable of Black hope and the end of the world, and looking at Black nihilism and eschatology to the end of everything. And I think for me that I'm sure hope has its place, but I think the way in which I look at things now is that, you know, in church we often talk about the fact that Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again. That's part of our Eucharistic liturgy every Sunday. I don't know if I'm hopeful, but I do know that I believe in that statement. And I don't know what that means. I don't know how to unpack it. But I believe that that is true. And I believe that whatever that looks like is basically the essence of that hope. But there's something a bit too light in how I think people talk about hope sometimes. I really struggle with. And when I read the writings of someone like MLK, when he's being honest, you know, there's real despair there, and real disillusionment. I'm not always sure that he's hopeful, but he does have a deep conviction in the fact that what Jesus has said is true, and that in the heart of the gospel, there is something that will come to birth, and we don't know exactly what that looks like. But I think I'm committed to that vision and to that end. I don't think it makes me hopeful or an optimist, but it means that I think the work is still worth doing for today. Really messy answer. But I just have a gut kind of pushback on the hope. I'm also wary of why often I find people want me to be hopeful. And is it for them? And if it is, then I can't be. Because I think when I heard Dr. Zoe Smithy say that to be Black and hopeful is to be a liar, I was like, you're right. Because I'm not sure it's true. And as a preacher, I really struggled with that. Because of course, on a Sunday, you know, you're meant to preach hope and give hope to people. And one of the things I'm deeply aware of as a parish priest is that people are deeply anxious. And yet I found myself even in preaching, wrestling with what it means to hold that intention. And so I just preach the gospel, but I think the gospel is more than hope. It doesn't have a word for it. Maybe it's resurrection, and maybe resurrection isn't hope. Maybe it's something else. It's the reality that death doesn't have the last word. I think hope doesn't go that far. Yeah. Thank you. It's a ramble.
Okay, just a final question.
You spoke about supporting this establishment of the church. and a deconstruction of it. What I'm tending to see now, and it goes back to when I was involved several years ago, the Bishop of Solvay produced a document about all member ministry and encouraging the laity to become a part of the church, an active part. And we see more and more vacancies in various churches or benefices where there's no one to actually carry on what the faithful want out of their church, which is generally speaking Holy Communion. So I tend to have a self-imposed sabbatical from the Church of England, and I'm supporting the Church of England where it's being led by the laity. Do you think there's a danger that if we go back to the old Judaic principle of pre-synagogue days where people were worshipping in homerooms, that might well just concentrate those people who are different through colour or whatever background, and it won't have a more homogenous thing than the church is trying to create. I'm not trying to defend the church, but you think we may end up ghettoising our faith because people will go where they feel that they can fit in more easily.
There's questions asking whether home groups might ghettoise the faith, try to find somewhere they're included.
I suppose so. There's always a danger, isn't there? If you meet in that kind of context, certain people who are in the know are able to find it, and it's not as obvious as meeting that in a church building. But I think I want to name the fact that the church is pretty ghettoised already, you know, and that we don't often acknowledge that enough. But actually, on the whole, people go to churches where there are people like them. You know, one of my criticisms of inclusive church, for example, is I think it's very inclusive in terms of sexuality, but when it comes to race, most inclusive churches don't have many black or brown people in them. And that is something that often people are not aware of. I think there's got to be a balance between, I think the church that I envisage is one that has less power and less privilege, and therefore is a bit more localized and a bit more, is less wealthy, and therefore looks more like that New Testament model of church. But I'm also someone who would describe himself now as an Anglo-Catholic who's quite committed to ritual and to our buildings and to all of that kind of stuff. So I think you need a mix, really. There needs to be communities in which people can respond to the local needs and can meet informally and be led, perhaps by the laity in particular. But I would want to see a kind of mixed economy, I think, of both things. But that risk of further ghettoization would be there. But it would be just worse than it is already, I think.
Well, we have come to the end of our time, so thank you so much, Jarel, for that very frank and open and rich conversation. And thank you too for the audience for joining us, for your participation. As I mentioned earlier, if you have cash and want to buy a copy of the book, there's one here. If not, you can order one from all sorts of bookshops. Thank you very much.
Thank you.